Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to begin this year sharing thoughts on the weekly Torah portion where I'm centering thinkers who are transformational thinkers and particularly, but not exclusively, Jewish feminist thinkers with the hopes of gaining some insight both from those thinkers and those thinkers as a frame to the weekly Torah portion that help us be agents of justice, agents of healing, agents of shalom in the world. And for Breshit, for beginning of the Torah and for beginning this year, I want to draw on the wisdom of Judith Plaskow, who 30 years ago published her groundbreaking book, Standing Again at Sinai, which was the first book-length treatment of a Jewish feminist vision. And that's been a great inspiration for me throughout my life over the past 30 years. And I'd like to start with really her stance on the world, which is that as a feminist, as a human being, as a Jew, she confronts a world that's fragmented by pain and by oppression, and in particular by the kind of oppression that comes from assuming a sort of male-dominated, hierarchical, patriarchal source of power. And she also believes, as a Jewish feminist, that we can mine the tradition to make ourselves agents into transforming that power. But we have to begin with Judaism itself to uproot those patterns of oppression that are within the tradition itself. And so for Judith Plaskow, the first question, the first problem is really a theological one. It's the question of who God is, and then secondary to that is who we are. Because for Plaskow, God is both a model of and a model for. The images that we have of God are reflective of our vision of the world, but also of our aspirations for how we want to act in the world. And so as we open up the Torah, as we open up Breshit, as we open up the book of Genesis, we can ask ourselves the question, what visions of God do we have? And is there, as Plaskow says, there is an underground stream of alternative images that can perhaps subvert the dominant image of God as male and as authoritarian that we have. Now, as we open up these first stories of Breshit, we actually have presented to us a number of images of God, which are hierarchical, patriarchal. Perhaps we can find deep meaning in them, but their range ultimately is limited. And so we have the story of God creating the world, seemingly as the sole creator of the world. We have the story of God setting up the Garden of Eden. And so God is portrayed here as the master of human destiny, of life and death, and ultimately of controlling the sexuality of human beings. And then, of course, Adam and Eve both eat from the apple. And so God is both judge and jury. And then towards the end of the Torah portion, we see restated again that God created humanity in God's image, but with a very specific agenda. God is the divine father, and so we have within us the capacity to procreate in imitation of the divine father. And so these are some archetypes, some images that come out of these opening chapters. But there is an underground stream. And I think what the underground stream does is to subvert these images and provide alternative images. And so if we look to the classical commentators, they all note that the way the Torah presents itself at the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim, does not mean what we think it means. That it doesn't mean that the world was created in a certain way, that it was created with an inherent order. If anything, what these opening lines do is suggest to us that the world that we see around us is not how it always was. And most provocatively, Nachmanides in the 13th century says the true meaning of Bereshit is not to be found in the apparent order of the words or the apparent order and patterns that we see, but it's rather, as he says, to be found in an oral tradition, which he calls Kabbalah, which ultimately remains secret. But there, we do see hints of this underground stream. And it begins with the very first midrash, the very first homiletical interpretation on Breshit, where the voice of the Torah calls out. And the Torah says, I was God's caregiver. I was God's teacher. I was God's artisan at the moment of creation. And then the Zohar, the pillar of 13th century Kabbalah in Spain, radically amplifies this idea, suggests a kind of intimate partnership between God and humanity in the ongoing creation of the world. And so for example, the Shekhinah, God's presence, which is identified as feminine, whose role with respect to humanity is one of great generosity, The Zohar says of the Shekhinah that the Shekhinah is the artisan of the world who consulted the Torah in creating the world. So God is not acting alone in this sense. There's another way in which our ongoing investigation of the world and our ongoing investigation of Torah itself contributes to the creation of the world, in which God is a partner with us in that creation. And so in one telling of it, when we devote ourselves to Torah and we come up with an insight that reaches beyond our experience, it actually comes to rest, and this is what the Zohar says, in the womb of God. And from that issues a new facet of creation. And then the Zohar imagines God giving explicit language for this partnership when God says about God's self, through my words, consulting the Torah, I created the cosmos. And so you, through your words, you do the same with me. And so we have this sense of God acting in partnership with human beings, with a give and take of, a reciprocal give and take of initiation and creation. And so we have this underground stream that breaks off in infinite directions. But really what it does is invite us to consider questions from our own experience about how we see ourselves in the world. And it offers us the possibility that we don't necessarily see ourselves or should see ourselves as passive players in this creation, as only subject to the forces of creation, but rather we are intimately a part of creation. And since we are intimate partners in creation, we are agents of creation, and not just physical creation, not just the perpetuation of the life breath, as beautiful and as transcendent as that is, but we are also participants in the ongoing moral and ethical regeneration of this world to bring to it our measure of justice and ahava, of love and compassion, and ultimately shalom. Thank you for listening in. Look forward to engaging in more explorations of the Torah portion through these transformative lenses, and I wish you a Shabbat Shalom.